My name is Himija. I am a security researcher at Censys, which is an internet scanning and network intelligence platform. And I'm really excited to be talking about some emerging research into tracking bulletproof hosting and abuse infrastructure using uh, the most loved and hated protocol, RDP. So I only have 25 minutes, so we're going to be zipping through, but I'm going to start with an intro to what is bulletproof hosting and why this is important, and talk about what RDP hostnames and Windows hostnames can actually tell us as a useful indicator for tracking threat actor activity. And then we're going to actually dig into some real world traffic data to see what these hosts are doing in the wild and what sorts of malicious things they're up to. And then finally dig into some research and some limitations of that research. Who am I? Like I said, my name is Himija. My specialty is going down rabbit holes and looking at weird stuff on the internet, and that includes finding all of the residual artifacts of threat infrastructure that a lot of people overlook. So what we're going to talk about today is some exploratory research characterizing attack infrastructure from specifically known bulletproof RDP hosts, and then investigating how those host names on those hosts can be a useful threat signal. But here's my disclaimer that we potential leads are doing that. Word potential is pulling a lot of weight in this topic, and we're going to be surfacing leads, but we did not purchase or do active probing of infrastructure for this talk. Okay, so I've said this word bulletproof. What is bulletproof hosting? Is it something? Is it a server I can shoot at and it will withstand it? So bulletproof hosting refers to hosting providers on the internet that have a history of intentionally evading abuse complaints, takedown requests, and other sorts of law enforcement inquiries related to malicious activity that occurs on their servers. This means that they're knowingly hosting things like malware distribution, phishing kits, command and control servers, ransomware distribution, and they ignore the interventions that a normal hosting provider would typically honor if they were to be reported. What is additionally important to talk about is what bulletproof hosting is not. It is not legitimate hosting providers whose customers occasionally run malware, but eventually gets cleaned up. It's not residential ISPs that have a bunch of botnets in them that generate malicious traffic that are just opportunistically exploiting things. And it's not compromised servers or reverse proxies where the upstream maybe takes a while to remediate the malicious activity, but it'll eventually get done in a year. The key differentiator with bulletproof infrastructure is that it's intentional abuse tolerance and it's structurally provisioned to support that sort of threat actor activity. It's not just any sketchy VPS provider. But the trouble is that at a glance, all of these types of infrastructure look the same on the outside when you look at them from a network perspective. And that makes it really difficult to track these down because there is no ground truth data for what is a bulletproof hosting provider. What typically happens is that the security community will build all of these signals and indicators over time to make a case. It's like a court of law where we converge on this classification using a bunch of different signals that we put together. But who even cares, right? Why track this at all? Bulletproof providers are effectively safe havens that enable criminal activity to persist over time through law enforcement takedowns, and they constantly are migrating to avoid consequences, which means it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole where you're trying to find the originators of this activity, but every time they're taken down, they just migrate to a new provider, which means that detecting them becomes extremely important when you want to actually get on the big stage of detecting where large scale attacks, where big ransomware campaigns are being sourced from, because this is the supply chain. This is where the ecosystem starts. So these are some of the ways that the community tends to infer what is a bulletproof provider. And these techniques have been in use for tens of years. The conversation first started around the early 2000s. But the trick is that you need to combine signals from each of these different types of indicators. We need to talk about what can we actually see in use on these servers? The technical artifacts like host names, which we're going to talk about in this talk. What are they deploying on their servers? Are they using identical configs and OS stacks? Are they using any sorts of reverse proxy chains that are associated with known bulletproof providers? But you also need behavioral. You need to see, okay, underneath what's sitting on the technical stack, what's going on at the BGP level? How quickly are they churning through their domains? How quickly are they recycling their blocks? Because those types of configurations are where the big differences lie. You'll see bulletproof providers rotate their domains and rotate their BGP prefixes and toss them out way more quickly than you would see it in a normal cloud provider or a residential ISP. And then finally, you need to actually establish intent, strategic intent, which is the hardest part, which is answering the question of how does it actually survive through takedown events? And the answer to that is migrating providers, completely rebranding their infrastructure, moving to a different network when they're taken down, but then continuing the same sorts of malicious activity through all of that underlying network infrastructure changes. So none of these are going to be definitive alone, but when you combine them, they can reveal these ecosystems. But the problem is the internet has changed a lot in the last 10 years. It is not what it was in 2015 when we were talking about DNS fast flux and talking about BGP prefixes. And it's no longer confined to these monolithic networks. It's so easy for me to say, okay, this ASN is a bulletproof provider. Let me just block the whole thing. And these operators know that. They're adapting. It's very common now to see these providers actually lease slices of IPs in these legitimate cloud networks, in these legitimate ISP networks, and just constantly change and dodge between them in order to hide in plain sight. And so that makes those traditional signals important, but noisier than they used to be. And so the key question, the key insight is, if that network infrastructure is constantly churning and changing, what is the thing that is more traceable about these hosting providers? And the answer is it's cheap to shift your IPs and routes, but it's way more expensive and more of a pain to change your tools, to change your tool chains, your images, and your templates. And that's why RDP can give us a pretty strong lens into this infrastructure. So why RDP? RDP has been around forever and has been understood to be a very abuse-heavy protocol. For those who aren't familiar, RDP stands for Windows Remote Desktop Protocol. It's commonly used in enterprise environments to gain remote access to a Windows machine, which means that it's a very valuable and targeted protocol for malicious operators, because what you'll see is threat actors try and brute force credentials to gain access to these RDP hosts, which effectively allows them an entry point into an enterprise network. And they will sell these. There's a whole ecosystem on the black market of selling access to RDP nodes and constantly churning them out and using them to attack other nodes to propagate. In addition, compared to things like SSH and other abuse protocols, RDP leaks a lot of useful configuration data, one of which is the actual name of the Windows system that it is providing access to. And it does so much more than other protocols. And what we'll see is that bulletproof operations will often amass these images and mass deploy clones of them. It's not typical to see RDP host names duplicated unless it's a cloned template that you're seeing just automatically provisioned over and over. And that automated toolkit is a way that you can actually provide the infrastructure level signal to try and find where these operators are hiding. So this is an example of what you might see. This is like an RDP farm, just tens and tens of cloned images that all provide access. So what's an example of where this has actually worked? So this is a case study from 2023 where an independent researcher found a host name. That Windows string is an example of an RDP host name that would be tied to a Windows image. And they found this living on a host that was tied to a Lockbit ransomware extortion case. And Lockbit is a Russian-affiliated ransomware campaign. They found when they pivoted on that host name, they found 105 other hosts using the same name. So that's an indicator that it was cloned on those hosts, also doing malicious things. So that was suspicious. And adding in other things like JAW4 and looking at the actual proxies that were used on these hosts, in addition to RDP, it led to a network of over 8,000 hosts, both tied to Lockbit and Conti. Via this one attacker-controlled golden image is what we call it, like a golden template that they constantly rely on as a tool to do malicious operations. So we've talked about kind of the value of RDP. First, let's establish what we're actually looking for when we're looking for malicious activity, and talk about what do we see now on how RDP is abused in known bulletproof networks. So those known monolithic bulletproof networks. And so we did this by combining our data from Censys using internet-wide scans of all the hosts in the world that are exposing RDP in these big bulletproof ASNs like LimeNet, RailNet, etc. And then combining them with our friends at Gray Noise who do honeypot telemetry scanning. And so we correlated everything that we saw online with everything that we saw those hosts sending to attack honeypots. So what this slide shows is when we looked at all of the malicious traffic, just malicious traffic coming from different types of infrastructure on the internet, we see this very clear difference in how known bulletproof operators actually attack the internet. So the red line is these known bulletproof providers. And what you'll see is as this graph goes, this is how many days it takes for the malicious activity from these same IPs to die out, to stop being seen. So notice how for residential ISPs, Mirai nodes, and cloud VPS providers, around maybe like 10 days is where like a same group of IPs will stop sending about half of their malicious activity, is where it'll die out. And then it's more of a long tail. Whereas for these bulletproof providers, it takes much, much longer for that infrastructure to stop sending malicious traffic, about 32 days longer. So that persistence of malicious activity is one of the core indicators for what is the core discriminator between bulletproof providers and these other networks. So when actually are these hosts most active? When are they doing most of their scanning? So when we looked at Gray Noise data over a month, so this represents the month of November, and on the left you see days of the week, and across the right, each of these columns is a different week. So what we see is these RDP hosts are most active on the weekends. You can see Saturday and Sunday are darker than the other days, which makes sense with what we know about threat actors specifically targeting systems when defenders and security teams log off from their typical workday. We also see that the last day of the month is when they're sending a ton of malicious traffic. They're absolutely hammering these sensors. And that is also pretty common with what you'd see in an automated attack workflow, where at the end of the month, you churn out, you replace your IPs, and then you spin up new attack infrastructure to start sending things. What are the hosts actually trying to do? So these activity tags are a list of all of the different things that Gray Noise Honeypots observed the malicious host trying to do to their sensors. And so what's interesting here is obviously the top most active one is RDP crawlers and brute force attempts. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier with a typical access broker type of workflow, where you're just crawling for RDP hosts and trying to gain even more access to sell them on the black market. And then, but the other things that we're seeing here that are more consistent with bulletproof infrastructure is this proxy ecosystem stuff. So SOC 5 proxies, which are typically used by these providers who are trying to obfuscate their traffic by proxying their attack activity through different front-end servers. And then finally, at the bottom, you see these different sorts of exploitation attempts targeting Citrix, ConnectY, Screen Connect, Palo Alto networks, firewalls, and that's pretty consistent with also behavior you'd see from a bulletproof provider where they're trying to just harvest these credentials from VPNs and network edge infrastructure that is very common to enterprise environments so that they can gain these footholds. Okay, so we've quantified what they're actually doing and how long the malicious behavior persists. But now let's look at how that persistence survives different infrastructure shifts with a real world story. So most of you are probably familiar with this. This was a big story back in earlier this year. There's a known or strongly suspected bulletproof provider named Stark Industry Solutions, which is widely known to be a potential Kremlin-linked bulletproof provider that has been linked to disinformation campaigns in Ukraine. So in May of this year, the EU levied financial sanctions on them, which is a typical sort of law enforcement regulatory sort of repercussion that you would see for a known bulletproof provider. But what we found by looking at Censys data over the course of the year is that those sanctions had pretty much no effect. And in fact, we found where that infrastructure has newly popped up in a different ASN. So this is an example of how they migrated their infrastructure. So on the left, you see the branding for Stark Industries, registered in 2020. And then they completely shifted their branding to this completely new ASN that was just registered in June of this year with a completely different number called Work Titans BV. And completely different front-facing branding and everything. But this is the same exact infrastructure, and I'll show you how we know that. So these are the counts of the number of IPs in each network as we see them in Censys. So you can see from the start of the year, over 20,000, 200,000 hosts in that first Stark Industries network. And then that network gets sanctioned in May. In June, they spin up an entirely new ASN. And then we see in late July in Censys data, they start to populate, they start to move over their IPs to this new ASN that's on a completely different brand. And then finally, what we observed just last month is that the old ASN starts to completely drain out and is now hovering around like 200, 100 hosts that aren't doing much. And pretty much all the infrastructure is now living in this new network. But how do we know that it's the same infrastructure, right? Maybe that trend was a complete coincidence. Maybe networks are increasing and decreasing all the time. There's a lot of ways that we know it's the same infrastructure, but I want to focus on how we know because of RDP. So when we actually look at the most popular Windows images that are deployed in each of these networks to do malicious activity, we take the top 6 and we kind of see how the prevalence of their deployment changes over time. So this is from August to when the migration started, finished around mid-October, November. And so this top is Stark Industries. The bottom is the new Work Titans ASN. Look at that mirror image of how they're deployed. It's almost a complete mirror image. And that kind of per template deployment, 1-to-1 ratio, that's not normal. That's not what you'd see if these were a bunch of randomly compromised hosts or like a random legitimate VPS churn or anything like that. They rarely preserve those types of ratios when they spin up and spin down hosts. And so this is a really strong image of deliberate attacker control templates that are just being moved over in order to avoid detection. And I'm a researcher, so I have to show you the math. So look at how close all of these are to 1. This is a ratio of per day, the growth in the new ASN and the decline of each template in the old ASN. And they are so close to being 1-to-1. So that's one example of how RDP can actually show us infrastructure migration of these bulletproof providers to find out where they move to. So second use case, okay, now let's expand beyond these things like Stark Industries and these big monolithic networks that are easy to block. And let's try and find some of those downstream slices where they might be linked to these known bulletproof clusters, but they're just hiding, right, to avoid detection. So So we're going to focus on auto-generated Windows templates because that is a big hallmark of threat actor infrastructure. They like to spin these up disposably and cheaply. And then we exclude any sort of Linux default so that we can find the things that are most likely to be these automatically provisioned things that are, this is key, found across a lot of IPs, but only a few networks, only like 20 to 25 networks, because that's the biggest way that you can actually filter out things that are just cracked templates that are available as commodity templates and commodity images that you would find pretty much in any malicious network. If you find them in a few ASNs heavily used in these dense IP24 prefixes, where that can show, okay, that is the smallest slice that that a hosting provider might be owning and controlling or leasing. And then we can use this to try and find these downstream ASNs from Bulletproof providers that have both high density and high churn as potential low-end resellers. And this will naturally filter out your typical sketchy clouds like OVH and things like that that aren't really in this criteria. Some additional signals you could talk about are honeypot telemetry, SOCs, looking for RDNS domain patterns is a huge one if they look similar. JA4 signatures and TCP fingerprinting, and those are all things that that could lend themselves to clustering as well. So when we looked at everything in a known Bulletproof monolithic ASN and clustered all of these hostname templates and then enriched them in gray noise data, these are the 7 templates that were generating the most malicious traffic. And so from here, we want to now try and find these tools, these templates, in other non-Bulletproof networks to see if they're tied. So we're trying to find things that appear in multiple ASNs, span density, and cluster in these sort of permissive or maybe abuse-tolerant networks. And so when we use these methods, I'm going to focus on the one third from the bottom, the J9D certificate, which we found could be a potential attacker leverage image. And I'll show you some interesting stuff that we found. So when we took that image and we actually cluster, okay, what other autonomous systems is this found in? So THE, that's actually the alternative name for that Work Titans provider I showed you before. So this is a known Bulletproof provider. UFO is also another pretty strongly suspected Bulletproof provider. So we have that, but then we want to now investigate these other networks in the middle. Obviously, not claiming anything. They could be completely just your ordinary hosting providers that unknowingly enable malicious activity. But there's one in particular that caught my eye, and it's this one. It's called GCSAS, or Global Connectivity Solutions. So when we actually looked at that network, it's 22 months old. It was registered last February. So that's young-ish. It's not super young, but it is still young-ish. But then what gets really interesting is when we look at the upstreams to this network. We see our familiar Work Titans BV is an upstream. And we also see a different known Bulletproof hosting provider named Oralogic, which is a strongly suspected Bulletproof provider based in Germany. So that is already a big tell. Obviously, a downstream is not guaranteed to be also Bulletproof, but it's pretty common to not peer with these networks. Nobody really wants to peer with criminals. And so when we actually took the hosts that were using that J9D certificate and then tried to find open instances of threats and open instances of malware, we found 2 very interesting things. So here's the first one. So an open directory, for those who don't know, is a host that's unintentionally or intentionally leaking its internal file system, which lends to finding some interesting things. So first, this is a host that's based in Russia on First Server Europe. And what we found when we looked inside the leaked file system on this host was a giant directory named bot that had a very suspicious executable named bot.exe that when we analyzed it was pretty clearly running some sort of botnet or some sort of mass compromise campaign. And then we actually found a VNC folder that had its own configuration file. And this is what was part of what was inside, was basically a configuration that set up the VNC service in reverse connection mode. So it would just keep phoning home to a C2 IP that I redacted here. And so this is very clearly a host that has established persistence to a C2. So that's super fishy. The second thing that we found was another host that was having the same template, hosted in Russia as well, but on a different network. Very similar service stack, though, very similar protocol stack. And in this one, we found even weirder stuff. We found a ton of files that started with brute. Brute work add a lot of PHP files and some zip files. And actually, it's truncated in this screenshot, but we found a folder full of logs of compromised hosts. So that's not something that you would think is accidental compromise. This is clearly something that is intentionally running a brute force as a service sort of workload. And so these are weak signals, right? So what could this be? So we have a single cloned Windows template known to be concentrated in a lot of known bulletproof networks that send a lot of malicious traffic, reused across a bunch of different permissive or abuse-tolerant VPS providers that is supporting a brute force workload, and it's hosted on this young-ish network that might fit a pattern of a reseller given its upstream, but that does not imply intent. And so this is still ambiguous. This could be a cracked VPS node that just shares these templates instead of a deliberate operation. And that really drives home that you need signals from all three indicators that I showed earlier. We have evidence of permissiveness and abuse happening here, but now we need evidence of survivability over time. So I'll wrap up here with some more talking about the limitations of these detections. It's way easier to say that something is abuse tolerant than bulletproof. Bulletproof is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but really you need to consider a ton of things over time in order to definitively say that. You're only ever really going to be like 80 to 70% confident, right? And the internet today has really evolved in such a way that there's so much ambiguity. And it's a constant game of cat and mouse to try and find where these operators are shifting their infrastructure. But it's incredibly important to do so because you have to find where these attacks are being staged in order for them to stop. Otherwise, they're just going to continue to propagate. And so we've only scratched the surface here. I think it could be really interesting to expand this to looking at churn over time, looking at other abuse protocols. WinRM and DCERPC and VPN providers are also very things that leak configuration fingerprints. We could look at how different RDP templates correlate with specific malware. We can see if certain templates are used to propagate, for example, like Beavertail or different C2s. We can more robustly map those reseller hierarchies by actually looking into these downstream ASNs that heavily reuse different sorts of toolmarks across these different protocols. And so, in summary, I hope that this sparked some thought about how RDP host names can be a signal for these golden images and these potential toolmarks, and how using tools instead of just looking at the infrastructure can be a way to see where these templates are actually in use beyond what is shifting at the infrastructure layer. And then finally, attribution is hard. It is much easier to establish something is malicious versus something is owned by this malicious entity. But we have to continue to do it. We have to continue to cluster these signals to find this type of infrastructure. Finally, I'm going to plug that we have an entire report all about malware. Looking at the first half of 2025. Our booth is right there, and it's teal and orange, and you can come pick up a hard copy, or you can scan. I promise this QR code is not a phishing link. You can scan it, or you can come get the hard link from us. And we look at a bunch of interesting things about open directories, the ephemerality of C2s, and measuring how C2 operations actually respond to being to law enforcement takedown requests. Thank you.